I just cannot give you 100% of an answer right now.
The moment Edward refuses to move forward with the wedding, everything changes. Marissa walks into the situation expecting commitment, answers, and some sign all the planning meant something, yet what she gets instead is a rejection strong enough to wipe out the future she thought was already settled. The silence after his decision feels worse than an argument because there is nowhere for either of them to hide. Marissa is stunned, embarrassed, and angry, while Edward stands firm and treats the decision as final. For him, the wedding is over. For Marissa, the rejection opens a much larger question about everything she gave up, everything she paid for, and every promise bringing her to this point. At first, Marissa still seems caught between heartbreak and disbelief. She keeps looking back at the choices she made because of the relationship, and each memory now carries a different weight. Plans once tied to a shared future start looking like risks she took while trusting Edward to stay committed. Expenses once felt normal, but now begin to look more serious. Sacrifices once seemed worthwhile, but now feel painfully one-sided. Edward refuses to reverse course, and his refusal slowly changes Marissa's focus. She stops asking whether the wedding might still happen and starts asking why she was left carrying so much after Edward walked away from the commitment itself. This is where the breakup stops feeling private. The deeper Marissa looks, the harder the task becomes to separate emotion from money. Wedding costs, earlier commitments, saved messages, and financial decisions begin forming a timeline. None of those pieces matter much by themselves, yet together they start telling a story Edward did not expect Marissa to organize. He believes ending the wedding ends the argument. Marissa begins thinking the opposite. To her, the rejection does not erase what happened before the rejection, especially if her decisions came from plans both of them had treated as serious. Edward stays consistent. He does not want the wedding, and he does not accept the idea changing his mind makes him responsible for every expense connected to the relationship. From his side, Marissa made her own choices. She spent money because she wanted to. She planned because she believed in the relationship. Nobody forced her to do either. His position gives Edward confidence because he sees the conflict as emotional fallout from a failed engagement, not something larger. Marissa's reaction starts changing in a way Edward does not seem ready for. The hurt is still there, but she becomes less interested in getting an apology and more interested in protecting herself. She goes back through records. She looks at wedding-related spending. She reviews messages connected to earlier plans and future commitments. The relationship is no longer being measured by affection. Now the relationship is being measured by dates, receipts, choices, and promises tied to real consequences. What looked like a painful breakup begins moving toward a dispute with a paper trail. This shift matters because Marissa is no longer fighting for the relationship. She is preparing for what comes after the relationship. Edward still believes the strongest part of his position is simple. He rejected the wedding before marriage took place, so he sees no reason for the fallout to become something formal. Marissa sees the same moment from another angle. She believes the decision came after she had already arranged too much of her life around commitments Edward had helped create. As the dispute grows, TLC becomes aware of the tension surrounding Edward and Marissa. The rejected wedding is no longer the only issue drawing attention. The financial questions, the conflict over prior commitments, and the possibility of a legal fight make the situation harder to contain. Edward still appears determined to hold his ground. He does not treat Marissa's preparation as something likely to change the outcome. From his perspective, records of spending do not prove he owes her anything. A receipt shows money left in account. A message shows a conversation happened. Neither one automatically proves Marissa has a claim against him. His confidence creates the next turn because Marissa does not rely on one receipt or one message. She starts arranging the material in order. Dates begin lining up with decisions. Payments begin matching wedding plans. Earlier commitments begin sitting beside later actions. Her argument starts taking shape around sequence rather than heartbreak. She wants to show why she made certain financial decisions when she made them and what she believed Edward was promising at the time. By now, another emotional conversation no longer interests her. Marissa wants accountability. Edward still sees the matter as a relationship ending badly, while Marissa sees a chain of choices carrying consequences beyond a breakup. The gap between those two positions becomes the center of the conflict. Neither side wants to move toward the other, and every new record makes the distance wider. When the courtroom fight finally enters the picture, Edward appears convinced Marissa has taken the dispute too far. His reasoning stays unchanged. Nobody forced her to spend money. Nobody forced her to plan a wedding. Nobody forced her to build expectations around a future never reached. He expects the case to fall apart once emotion is stripped away. From his perspective, the court should care about obligation, not disappointment, and he believes Marissa will struggle to connect the two. Marissa arrives with something more dangerous than anger. She arrives organized. The records are placed in order, the spending is connected to dates, and the messages are tied to the decisions she made before Edward rejected the wedding. Then one part of the timeline starts drawing attention for a reason Edward did not expect. The question is no longer only how much Marissa spent. The question becomes when Edward knew he wanted out, compared with when Marissa was still being led to believe the wedding was moving forward. Once the gap comes into focus, the entire dispute starts looking different, and Edward's confidence begins facing its first serious test. Edward walks into court with a completely different view of what happened between him and Marissa. He does not see a financial betrayal. He sees a relationship falling apart, two people changing, and a wedding ending before either person made the final commitment. In his mind, the history between them supports his position because relationships change every day, feelings shift, and plans sometimes collapse before anyone reaches the altar. His defense rests on one basic idea. Marissa made choices while she believed the relationship had a future, but those choices do not automatically become Edward's debt simply because the future disappeared. For the first few moments, his position sounds stronger than Marissa expected. Edward is not denying the relationship existed. He is not denying wedding plans were discussed. He is not denying money was spent. Instead, he challenges what all of those things mean. A failed engagement is painful, but pain alone does not prove somebody owes money. That distinction becomes important almost immediately because Marissa now needs more than heartbreak. She needs a clear connection between what Edward promised, what she did because of those promises, and when those decisions happened. Marissa seems prepared for exactly this argument. She does not enter the courtroom trying to convince Edward to return. She does not frame the case around losing him. Her attention stays on commitments made before the rejection. Wedding expenses begin appearing one by one. Shared plans follow. Financial choices start being placed beside messages about their future. Each piece seems ordinary when viewed alone, but Marissa's case depends on how those pieces connect over time. She wants one point understood. She did not wake up after the breakup and invent a future Edward never discussed with her. She planned around a future both of them had been treating as real. That change in Marissa creates a different emotional atmosphere between them. Edward appears ready for accusations about love, loyalty, and disappointment. Instead, he faces dates and decisions. Marissa no longer needs him to admit he hurt her feelings. She wants the record to show why she believed the wedding was moving ahead. Every expense now carries a second question. What was Edward saying when Marissa spent the money? Every plan carries another question. Did Edward already have serious doubts while Marissa kept moving forward? The courtroom does not immediately accept everything Marissa presents. This becomes Edward's first major opening. Some parts of her position rely heavily on emotion. There are sacrifices difficult to measure in money. There are expectations formed inside a relationship rather than written as firm commitments. There are decisions Marissa made because she trusted Edward, yet trust by itself does not settle a financial dispute. For the first time since the record started appearing, Edward seems to gain ground. The mood shifts. Marissa has spent much of the case connecting her choices to the future she believed they shared, but Edward's side points toward a hard reality. People spend money in relationships without expecting repayment. Couples make plans without signing contracts for every decision. Engagements end. Weddings get canceled. Feelings change. If every painful breakup became a financial case, the line between personal disappointment and legal responsibility would disappear. For a moment, Marissa's argument looks less secure. Edward appears to recognize the opening. His original position suddenly has weight again. He does not need to prove the relationship was perfect. He only needs to show Marissa acted voluntarily, and some of her losses came from ordinary relationship risks. The courtroom tension changes because the outcome no longer feels like a straight path toward Marissa. Some of her claims begin looking difficult to separate from the emotional damage caused by the breakup. Then the timeline starts becoming a problem for Edward. The records are not presented as one giant accusation. They are placed in sequence. A wedding-related payment appears beside a planning decision. A planning decision sits beside an earlier statement about their future. Another expense follows. Another commitment appears close behind. Slowly, the question changes from whether Marissa chose to spend money to what information she had when she made those choices. This difference is small at first, but the pressure grows. Edward's argument depends heavily on the idea feelings changed, and the relationship became unstable. Marissa's records begin testing when those changes happened. If Edward's doubts developed early, yet Marissa kept making major wedding decisions while receiving reassurance close to the ceremony, his defense becomes harder to explain. The court no longer needs to decide whether Edward had the right to cancel a wedding. He did. The harder issue becomes whether Marissa kept taking financial steps because Edward continued presenting the future as secure after his own position had already started changing. The dates begin carrying more weight than the emotion. Payments line up with wedding planning. Messages line up with decisions. Earlier statements begin sitting uncomfortably close to the period when Edward later says the relationship had become unstable. None of this proves every part of Marissa's case, but the picture becomes harder for Edward to dismiss as simple anger after rejection. At the same time, another source of pressure starts hanging over him. TLC is aware of the growing controversy, and Edward now understands the dispute is no longer confined to him and Marissa. The network has not announced a final decision. Nothing has been settled on that front. Still, the uncertainty creates another problem because every new courtroom development carries consequences beyond the relationship. Edward entered expecting one fight. Now he faces a legal dispute while his standing with TLC sits under a cloud he has no control over. Marissa stays focused on the records. This matters because her behavior weakens Edward's assumption about her motivation. She is not using the courtroom as a path back into the relationship. She is building a case around what happened before the relationship ended. Her strongest argument is no longer how badly the rejection hurt. Her strongest argument is how close certain commitments came to the moment Edward finally refused the wedding. Then the final group of records turns the room in another direction. These are tied to the days leading up to the rejection. They place Marissa's major decisions much closer to the planned ceremony than Edward appears comfortable with. She was still spending, still planning, and still organizing her future around the wedding during a period when Edward now describes the relationship as unstable. That alone raises a difficult question, but the messages surrounding those decisions create even more pressure. Marissa's case no longer looks like something assembled from anger after being rejected. The sequence suggests she had reasons, close to the wedding itself, to believe Edward still intended to move forward. Edward entered court arguing feelings changed. Now the timing of those changing feelings becomes the issue he needs to explain, because the closer Marissa's final decisions move toward the day he walked away, the harder it becomes to dismiss everything as money she freely chose to spend with full knowledge of where the relationship stood. Why now? Neither side has complete control of the case. Marissa has brought stronger records into court, and the timeline has started creating problems for Edward, yet nothing has reached the point where his position collapses. He still has room to argue Marissa read too much into a relationship already showing signs of trouble. From his side, she believed the wedding was secure because she wanted to believe it. From her side, she kept moving forward because Edward continued giving her reasons to think the same future still existed. That difference now matters more than all the anger surrounding the breakup. The court keeps returning to one simple issue. When did Edward know he no longer wanted the wedding, and when did Marissa understand the same thing? Everything starts turning around those two moments. Edward's behavior receives closer attention because his defense depends on feelings changing over time. Nobody is arguing he had to marry Marissa after changing his mind. The harder issue concerns what happened between the first serious doubts and the final rejection. If Edward had already started pulling away while Marissa continued making expensive decisions, the court needs to understand what she was hearing from him during that period. But Marissa does not escape difficult questions either. There had been problems before the wedding collapsed. There had been uncertainty. There were moments when the relationship did not feel secure. That raises an uncomfortable point for her. If she saw warning signs, why did she keep spending money? Why did she keep planning? Why did she keep arranging her future around a wedding when the relationship already carried tension? Those questions matter because Marissa's case depends on more than saying she trusted Edward. Trust explains her emotional state, but the records need to explain her financial choices. For a while, Edward looked stronger. One piece of evidence Marissa believed would connect his earlier assurances to one of her major decisions does not carry the weight she expected. The record confirms communication between them, yet the wording does not prove Edward made the firm promise Marissa hoped to establish. The distinction hurts her because the entire case has started moving away from feelings and toward timing, meaning, and responsibility. Edward suddenly has space to breathe. His position starts sounding more reasonable again. He argues through his conduct that Marissa is treating ordinary relationship conversations like guarantees. Couples discuss weddings. They talk about homes, money, and future plans. Those conversations do not always survive changes inside the relationship. If Marissa took every hopeful statement as a binding commitment, Edward believes the problem lies in how she understood the relationship, not in a deliberate effort to mislead her. For the first time, Marissa looks exposed. The courtroom atmosphere shifts because her documentation no longer feels unbeatable. One weak connection raises doubts about others. If one message means less than she believed, perhaps another does too. If one expense came from her own expectations rather than a clear commitment from Edward, perhaps the same argument reaches other payments. And this is where the case becomes dangerous for Marissa. She does not need every record to work against her. She only needs enough uncertainty for Edward's explanation to feel believable. Then another part of the timeline changes the pressure again. A separate record connects wedding arrangements with a period when Edward's private doubts had already grown more serious. The timing matters because Marissa was still moving forward with decisions tied directly to the ceremony. Her planning had not slowed in the same way Edward now describes his commitment fading. The contradiction does not prove Edward planned to hurt her. The record does something more focused. It raises doubt about whether Marissa understood how far his feelings had already shifted. That distinction pulls the case back toward her. Edward had every right to decide marriage was wrong for him. The courtroom is not trying to force a relationship back together. The dispute now centers on whether Marissa had an honest picture before she continued spending money tied to a wedding Edward was already questioning in private. That issue is harder for him to escape. If his doubts were serious, Marissa's side wants to know why the planning continued without a clear warning. If the relationship was already close to collapse, why did she still believe the ceremony was moving ahead? Edward needs an explanation strong enough to connect his private uncertainty with the reassurance Marissa says she continued receiving. The case no longer turns on who suffered more after the breakup. It turns on what each person knew before the breakup became final. Outside the courtroom, another problem is developing inside this dramatized storyline. TLC is reviewing the growing controversy separately from Marissa's claim. The network issue does not decide what happens in court, and the court does not decide Edward's future with the show. Still, Edward now understands the same events are being examined from two directions. What began as a rejected wedding has become much harder to contain. TLC is no longer looking at the situation as simple relationship drama. The questions surrounding Edward's conduct, the timing of his decision, and the growing public dispute have created another layer of uncertainty. No final decision has been announced, yet the review places new pressure on him at the worst possible moment. Edward now faces one problem he expected and another he did not. Inside court, Marissa's case has recovered from its setback. Her weaker evidence did not destroy the larger timeline. Instead, the next record brought attention back to the period Edward most needs to explain. Outside court, his standing with TLC is becoming less secure as the controversy grows. Marissa's final record changes the mood because this time the issue is not how hurt she felt after Edward rejected the wedding. The issue is timing. The record sits close to the period Edward has spent describing as unstable, yet Marissa was still making decisions tied directly to the ceremony. That detail forces everyone back to the same uncomfortable question. If Edward's doubts had already become serious, how much did Marissa know before she kept spending money and arranging her future around a wedding he was no longer sure he wanted? For Marissa, this is the point where her case becomes easier to understand. She is not asking the court to punish Edward for falling out of love. She is trying to connect specific choices to specific assurances. Earlier wedding expenses now matter again. The shared planning from before the breakup matters again. The messages she organized at the beginning of the dispute return with more meaning because the dates place them against Edward's own description of when the relationship began falling apart. Edward pushes back hard against that interpretation. His position stays focused on one idea. Doubt does not equal a final decision. A person might question a relationship and still hope things improve. Someone might continue discussing plans while trying to decide whether those plans still feel right. Edward's defense depends on keeping those private doubts separate from the moment he finally refused the wedding. If he had not fully decided to leave earlier, then Marissa's timeline does not prove he deliberately kept her moving toward a future he already knew would never happen. For a moment, that argument keeps the case balanced. Marissa has evidence showing planning continued. She has records showing money was spent. She has messages showing the future remained part of their conversations. But she still needs the sequence to show more than a relationship under pressure. The court keeps separating the emotional damage from the financial dispute because those are not the same thing. Edward hurting Marissa does not automatically make every expense his responsibility. That distinction becomes one of the hardest moments for her. Some of what Marissa lost belongs to the emotional side of the breakup. Time cannot be repaid through a courtroom. Hope cannot be placed on a receipt. The embarrassment of expecting a wedding and facing rejection does not create a financial obligation by itself. Marissa appears to understand this now, which is why she stops leaning on the humiliation and stays with the records. Her strongest position concerns decisions carrying a clear financial cost. That is where Edward faces more pressure. The wedding spending Marissa documented earlier is examined beside the period when Edward says his feelings were already changing. Shared plans are compared with later explanations. The court looks at what Marissa did, when she did it, and what Edward's behavior suggested at the same time. Slowly, the dispute becomes narrower, but the narrower version is more dangerous for him. Edward still has a route out. Several of Marissa's claims remain uncertain. Some expenses look connected to choices she made on her own. Some conversations do not amount to firm commitments. Some sacrifices belong more to the relationship than to any clear financial agreement. The court is not accepting every part of Marissa's story simply because the wedding ended badly. That gives Edward room to believe the worst outcome is slipping away. Then his earlier position comes back. From the beginning, Edward has relied on the idea that the relationship became unstable and his feelings changed before the wedding rejection. That explanation helped him when Marissa's weaker evidence looked too emotional. Now the same explanation creates a problem because the documented timeline places continued wedding planning beside the period when he says his commitment was already weakening. The contradiction is not about whether Edward had doubts. The problem is what happened while those doubts were growing. If he now says the relationship had been unstable for some time, Marissa's side points toward the planning that continued during the same period. If he says he still had hope, he needs to explain why his later description of the relationship sounds far more settled in the opposite direction. Either answer creates pressure because the timeline no longer fits comfortably with the simple version he brought into court. Edward wanted the case to remain about personal choice. Marissa has turned the focus toward information. She chose to spend money, but what did she believe when she spent it? She chose to continue planning, but what was Edward communicating while she made those plans? She chose to trust the relationship, but did she understand how serious his doubts had become? Those questions begin weakening the confidence he showed at the start. At the same time, the pressure outside court reaches its own turning point. TLC completes its internal review inside this dramatized storyline. The network's decision has nothing to do with what the court will rule. One process deals with the dispute between Edward and Marissa. The other concerns TLC's separate relationship with Edward and how the growing controversy affects his future with the show. Edward now has no way to treat the two problems as one issue. Even if he defeats part of Marissa's claim, the network has made its own judgment. Even if TLC acts against him, that does not decide whether Marissa is owed money. The separation makes the situation heavier because Edward faces consequences coming from different directions for different reasons. Marissa watches the change without returning to the anger she showed after the rejected wedding. That silence says more than another confrontation would. Earlier, she wanted Edward to understand what his decision had done to her. Now she seems finished with needing him to understand anything. Her focus has narrowed to the outcome of the case and what she intends to do once the decision arrives. Edward enters the final stage, knowing the court has not accepted every claim against him, but his own timeline has become harder to defend. At the same time, TLC's internal decision is ready to become part of his future whether he agrees with it or not. And while Edward prepares for both consequences, Marissa appears strangely calm. She is no longer fighting for the wedding. She is no longer fighting for Edward. She is not even looking toward him for a reaction. Whatever she decides after the ruling, she already seems certain of one thing. Edward is no longer part of the future she is trying to protect. The ruling lands without giving either side everything they wanted. Marissa does not receive every financial claim she brought forward, and the court does not treat the failed wedding as proof Edward owes her for every painful consequence connected to the relationship. Some losses remain personal. Some expenses stay tied to choices she made herself. But the stronger records tell a different story, and those records carry enough weight to change the ending Edward believed he had already controlled. The court separates heartbreak from responsibility. Marissa's humiliation after the rejection is not treated like a debt. The emotional damage is not given a price. The time she spent planning a future with Edward is not turned into a number. What matters is the smaller group of financial decisions supported by the clearer timeline, the documented commitments, and the assurances surrounding those decisions. That is where Edward loses. His defense had depended on choice. He kept returning to the idea that Marissa made her own decisions, spent her own money, and continued planning because she wanted the wedding to happen. The ruling does not erase that point. Instead, it limits how far the argument protects him. Marissa made choices, yes, but the court accepts that some of those choices were tied closely enough to the commitments Edward continued making before the rejection. Marissa wins the central part of the dispute. Not everything. Enough. And for Edward, that difference matters because he entered believing the entire case would fall apart once emotion was removed. Instead, removing the emotion helped Marissa in the areas where her records were strongest. The court does not reward anger. It follows the documented sequence. That same sequence Edward spent so much time challenging becomes the reason his broad defense no longer covers every financial consequence. Marissa's reaction is quieter than anyone might expect. There is no obvious celebration. She does not turn toward Edward looking for satisfaction. She does not appear interested in making the moment larger than the decision itself. For most of the dispute, she had been forced to defend something deeper than money. She wanted the record to show the future she planned around Edward was not something she invented after he walked away. Now, she is part of that answer. Before the weight of the ruling settles, Edward faces the second outcome, hanging over him. TLC has completed its own review inside this fictional storyline, and the network ends its relationship with him. The timing makes the moment heavier because the network decision arrives separately from the courtroom result. The court does not remove Edward from television. TLC does not decide Marissa's financial case. Yet both consequences reach him in the same final stretch, leaving little space between one loss and the next. The relationship is gone. His main courtroom argument has failed on the strongest part of Marissa's claim. Now his place with TLC is gone too. For the first time, Edward no longer looks like someone controlling the direction of the story. Earlier, rejecting the wedding gave him the final say over whether the marriage happened. He made the decision. He stood by the decision. He expected everything after that moment to become Marissa's problem to process. Instead, the consequences kept moving. Marissa organized the records. The dispute reached court. The timeline received scrutiny. And TLC reached its own conclusion. What happens next becomes less about punishment and more about what Edward understands after the choices are finished. Regret begins to look different when the consequences become permanent. Before the ruling, he defended his right to change his mind. After the ruling, the harder truth is that changing his mind did not remove responsibility for every decision made around him before Marissa knew the future had changed. That does not turn Edward into a simple villain. Relationships fail. People hesitate. Feelings change. Fear enters decisions at the worst times. Someone might know marriage feels wrong without knowing how to end the relationship cleanly. Edward's mistake is not reduced to refusing the wedding. The deeper problem sits inside everything surrounding the refusal, especially the distance between what he understood privately and what Marissa believed while she kept moving forward. By the time he seems to understand the size of what has disappeared, Marissa has already moved beyond the point where understanding from Edward changes anything. That becomes her real victory. She does not win because Edward suffers. She does not win because TLC ends its relationship with him. She wins because she no longer needs Edward to reverse his decision. Earlier, the rejected wedding left her looking for answers. She wanted to understand how the future disappeared so quickly. Then the financial questions took over. After that, the courtroom became about proving her decisions were connected to commitments she believed were still real. Now the ruling is finished. And Marissa no longer has a reason to stay inside the same argument. Edward faces the cost of everything at once, but regret arrives too late to rebuild trust. Wanting a different outcome after consequences appear is not the same as repairing the damage before those consequences arrive. Marissa understands that difference, and she refuses to treat Edward's final emotional shift as a new beginning. There is no dramatic reconciliation. There is no last attempt to save the engagement. There is no reason to restart the same cycle. Marissa simply leaves. That quiet exit carries more weight than another fight because it returns the story to the moment where everything began. Edward once believed rejecting the wedding placed the final decision in his hands. At that time, Marissa seemed to lose the future while he controlled the ending. But the rejection was only the beginning. Marissa accepted the wedding was over. She stopped chasing the relationship. She separated emotional pain from financial responsibility. She brought the strongest part of her case forward, survived the weak points, and won where the records supported her. Then she did something Edward never prepared for. She stopped needing anything else from him. The relationship does not end with Marissa begging Edward to reconsider. It ends with her walking away after receiving the answer she came for, leaving Edward behind with the consequences of a decision he once believed ended everything. Now the question belongs to everyone watching. Was Marissa right to take the dispute all the way to court after Edward rejected the wedding, or should she have walked away the moment he refused to marry her? Tell me which side you believe had the stronger position, and what you would have done in Marissa's place.